And yeah, thanks a lot, Mark, for presenting for us, for offering to present this review on a very important topic for us who study salt tectonics on passive and salt diapirism, passive and active salt diapirism and syn-diapiric strata and deformation. So before passing you the stage, I'd like to introduce you to the audience for, I think most people here already know you, but I still like to introduce you. So Mark received a BS in biology from the California Institute of Technology in 1976. He had also a MS in geology from the University of California and a PhD in structural geology from University of Colorado at Boulder in 1991. He worked for Sohio Petroleum Co. From 82 to 85, Geo-Logic Systems from 85 to 89, and Alastair Beach Associates in Glasgow, Scotland from 1989 to 1992. He then returned to the University of Colorado as a research assistant professor before actually founding his company in 1998, where he now consults and teaches for petroleum industry and also conducts research sponsored by industry. His primary research and consulting interests are focused on the styles and kinematics of salt tectonics, as well as the processes of salt-sediment interaction, the architecture and evolution of passive margins, and the applications to petroleum industry. He's the author and co-author of over 100 papers, and he's been an AAPG Distinguished Lecturer and an AAPG International Distinguished Instructor, and has been awarded the Doris M. Kurtz Medal by the GCSCPM, as a big acronym, and the Robert G. Berg Outstanding Research Award by the AAPG. So without further ado, Mark, I'll leave it up to you now, and thanks again.
Well, thanks very much. And I actually want to take just a second to thank the organizers of this, this whole webinar series, Rochelle and Clara and you guys, and I think it's been fantastic during this time, and of course one of the big goals here was to have a diverse group of speakers, etc. And I'm proof of that. I'm the old white guy. So with that, let's go ahead and share my screen. All right. We can go to slideshow. Hopefully everyone can see that. All right, so I want to start out by thanking Kate Giles at the University of Texas at El Paso. She is my co-author on this, so anything you like is my doing. Anything you don't like is you can blame her. Kate runs the Salt Sediment Interactive Research Consortium at the Institute of Tectonic Studies there in El Paso. And of course, I also want to thank the companies that sponsor us, and it's varied over the years, but this is the most recent group. So thanks very much for that, because it does, it pays a tiny bit for some of my hobbies, and the research is the hobby. But what we want to do here is the motivation was this, is we kept discussing, because we kept finding that the existing definitions for passive and active diapirism are actually overlapping, as I'll show you, and therefore ambiguous. They're also equated to downbuilding and upbuilding respectively. Those terms themselves are problematic, as I'll also show you. And because of that, there's been this, in my opinion at least, this increasing conflicting usage, lack of consensus, and hence confusion in talks, in literature, in companies, etc. So what we're going to do is I'm going to review the historical definitions and some of these problematic aspects. Some of the specific things I'll talk about is actually what is downbuilding, what is upbuilding, and how applicable are they to our modern understanding. I'm going to talk about, very importantly, what the absence or the presence and thickness of a diapir roof as a criteria for distinguishing between different styles. There's the related concept of halokinetic sequences, which of course we've been working on for many years. And then that itself leads into the contrast between those and minibasin-scale growth sequences. And we're going to suggest some solutions and propose some revised definitions. And I want to state right up front is, our goal here is not to get into fights with people or to impose our views on everyone else, but there is conflicting usage. And so if we can sort of move past that in some way, ultimately we'll have better understanding and communication, which I think is very useful. So by the way, I should mention the first half of the presentation is available online at the AAPG bulletin, what they call online first. And then the second half is not something that's publicly available at this time. It builds on something it did many years ago. So let's look at the existing definitions. And this comes from Mike, and I saw he's here in the audience, from Mike and Martin's Glossary of Salt Tectonics that first came out in 11. And their definitions themselves built on terms from Barton in 33, specifically for these terms, and Nelson in 89. And the original glossary by Martin and Chris Talbot back in 91. And of course, there's more to these, but I'm emphasizing the main parts of the definitions. Active diapirism is diapir rise by arching, uplifting, or shouldering aside its roof. And if you look up upbuilding, it says see active diapirism, so they equate the two. And then passive diapirism is the syn-depositional, that's important, growth of a diapir whose exposed crest rises as sediments accumulate around it. The diapir's crest can be periodically buried, but the diapir repeatedly breaks through this thin ephemeral roof. And again, downbuilding is equated to passive diapirism. Well, right away you can see part of the problem, because active diapirism basically arches and uplifts and moves through its roof, but passive diapirism is exposed, but wait, it can have a roof that it breaks through. So right away, we've got an issue there. But let's look at downbuilding. This is the original figure from Barton, well, colored up by me. He had a reference frame of so-called Earth space, and it's really poorly defined, and Martin back in 88 kind of redefined it as the reference frame of the depositional surface. But the key to it, the only thing that downbuilding has is that the top of the diapir stays fixed in this reference frame. Everything else sinks. So the base of the mini basin sinks and the top of the mini basin sinks and new sediment is added. And the base of the salt sinks. And the only thing that stays fixed is the top of the diapir. And understand, and you can see this from the figure, the top of the diapir is actually not at the surface. Oh, it might be, but that's not how he depicted it. So that was classic downbuilding. He didn't have anything for upbuilding. He called it upthrusting. He didn't have a figure, but he described it as a diapir crest rising through the overburden with a fixed base of salt. So if we move forward a lot of years, because this is 33, and we look around 1990, this is from Martin's work in 88, their glossary in 91, and then again, Nelson in 89. This pretty much depicts the story at that time. If we look at downbuilding first, we have suddenly moved to having the diapir at the surface, although they do say, or just beneath. So again, there's this the slop in the definition. And the point is, again, that it stays fixed, whether it's right at the surface or just beneath a thin roof, as again, the mini basin sinks, specifically the base of the mini basin and the strata as you add more sediment, and the base of the salt sinks, as you see. And then what they did is Martin had changed the name of upthrusting to upbuilding, just to be more consistent with downbuilding. It was also called active piercement. I forgot to mention that downbuilding it was called passive piercement by Nelson, and upbuilding was active piercement. And the idea there is the diapir just intrudes through a thick overburden while the base of salt stays fixed. And these people, at least, all considered the upbuilding to be mechanically implausible, which we would agree with. And so they thought this diapirs grew by downbuilding. There was a revolution right after this that, of course, Martin was very much involved with, as we all know. And this was the very famous paper by Bruno van der Velde and Jackson in 92. I consider it to be the most groundbreaking paper, innovative and influential paper in the history of salt tectonics personally, but that's just my take on it. But, you know, they did a number of things in this paper, but what they did is they showed how you can trigger diapirism through extension, as we know, and this is effectively boudinage of the overburden. We get our reactive diapir. The point is that what happens is you create a differential load and therefore a pressure on the salt. And at some point, if that roof is thin enough and weak enough, and there's enough pressure on the salt will actually push through that thinned roof. So it arches and breaks the roof shown here, and that's what they sort of redefined in a sense as active diapirs. And they borrowed from Nelson's term and called this the active stage. Once it pushed through, then they enter this long-lived growth of the diapir as the mini basin sink, which they called the passive stage, again, borrowing that term. And as they say, it continues to rise near or at the surface. Again, is it at the surface or near it? Because this is also near the surface and so on. So again, you're still seeing a little bit of the confusion in here. About the same time, Dan Schultzela, who was also in Martin's lab, the AGL, of course. By the way, I should mention that that short paper that's online in the AAPG bulletin is dedicated to the memory of Martin, because you can't talk or even think about salt tectonics without thinking about Martin Jackson and his incredible influence, and especially the topics that I'm covering here today. So this was this paper. It was based on numerical modeling. The idea was that active diapirism is this forceful intrusion by a diapir. Whether that results in folding or faulting of different types doesn't really matter at the moment. The point is the diapir roof is lifted above its regional datum. So the regional datum here would be the mini basin level. And this goes up and lifting that roof above that datum because of pressure in the diapir. So what this has all led to is sort of the common, but by no means universal usage is the following: that people call something an active diapir growing today or one in the past, or again, equivalent to upbuilding, when you have a folded and or faulted roof, when your strata in the roof are above the regional level, or for buried diapirs trying to unravel the history in the past, if you see evidence of an upturned collar of strata around the diapir. Whereas passive diapirism, or again, downbuilding, is, and this is again what a lot of people use, by no means universal, is the diapir actually has an exposed crest. And if it's a buried diapir, and again, you're looking at its history in the past, then if you see undeformed flanking strata, then it was a passive diapir. Well, right away, there's another problem, because I've seen many, many examples where on seismic data, the strata look like they're undeformed. They come in and truncate against the edge of salt. But when you drill wells or when your seismic images get better, you'll see the strata are indeed turned up. So wait, what scale are we talking about here? So let's come to this concept of what's gone up and what's gone down. This is from something I did almost 20 years ago. What you're looking at is a regional line here. It's a 2D time migrated line, but we're just looking at the seafloor, so it doesn't really matter. It's highly squashed, going from the shelf edge to the abyssal plain in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And the question is, how do we define regional datum for a horizon? In other words, are we looking at downbuilding? Are we looking at upbuilding? Or are we looking at something in between? So let's postulate that this is all pure downbuilding. Well, that means the tops of all the diapirs are, by definition, at regional. So we can draw that by linking, because there's a little diapir right there. We can link the tops of each diapir, not the roof above it, but the top of the salt. And so this is what you get for regional. And it clearly fails out here by the Sigsbee escarpment, because that is, by definition, regional out here. So it's unreasonable, doesn't seem to work too well. Well, let's take a look at the alternative. Let's say this is pure upbuilding, so that regional is the mini basin floors and all the diapirs have gone up above regional. Well, then you also have an unrealistic geometry, especially up here by the shelf edge. And you can see again here how the diapirs are above regional. That would be the definition of upbuilding. And you've still got problems out in here. It doesn't seem to work very well. That's not a normal depositional regional profile. So if I just draw something in that's a little more reasonable, like if you didn't have salt, you might see this sigmoidal type of geometry for regional. you can see that, there are diapirs that are above regional, and there are mini basins that are below regional. Not always, there's still some issues here, but of course shortening is going on out in this area, so that's part of the issue. But it's just not that simple. So just the very concepts of pure upbuilding and pure downbuilding don't really work. In reality, it's the diapirs that, not always, but in most cases, the diapirs go up and the mini basins go down relative to any kind of regional datum. And there was an old term, they called it mixed building, but I think we'd all agree we might want to just avoid that one. So moving forward in time, because we're still on this history, as most of you or all of you know, Kate Giles and I, working with Tim Lawton, and this is when Kate and Tim were at New Mexico State University, came up with this concept of halokinetic sequences. Well, actually, they came up with it, and I sort of muscled my way in a couple of years later. The point is that this is where we see next to diapirs these stacked unconformity bound packages of these upturned collars, these thinned and upturned strata. And very importantly, it's always within about 1 kilometer of the diapir edge. It can be as little as 20 meters, but somewhere in that range. And again, they're neither downbuilding nor upbuilding. The mini basin sink and the diapir tops, the crests rise. That roof gets drape folded because of that relative movement. And very importantly, we define this, we specifically define this in this paper as due to passive diapirism, because we're emphasizing that near surface syn-depositional aspect of passive diapirism. And we had evidence that it was occasionally exposed because we get diapir-derived detritus in mass wasting deposits. So it fit that definition that you saw, that I showed you from Mike and Martin, where it is this near surface growth, either at the surface or buried. The only difference really is, whereas they emphasize the being at the surface with very temporary covering by a roof, we tend to emphasize that it's covered by a roof and may at times be uncovered. So just a slightly different emphasis there. And I'll come back to that in a moment. A couple more historical figures, and then we'll get in my own hysterical raving. Oh no, sorry, I'm not going to talk about the politics. I promised. Sorry, folks, people know me, know I can't resist. This is a variation on a theme. This is published by Ian Alsop and co-authors looking at the Mount Saddam diapir in Israel. But you can see they've got passive and active diapirism. This is one of their figures. And you can see in passive diapirism, they actually have the mini basin going down relative to an apparently immobile top of salt. And you have folding of the roof, as we just talked about, and they associate this with wedge halokinetic sequences as one of our 2 end-member styles that I haven't mentioned yet. In contrast, they have a scenario here in which they called active diapirism, in which the mini basin is apparently fixed. They didn't put an arrow there, and the diapir crest rises. In this case, they show it fault bounded, and they associate with hook halokinetic sequences. And they emphasize that it switches back and forth between these 2 processes. One problem with this, of course, Kate and I tend to take this a little personally, because we define wedge and hook halokinetic sequences as both part of passive diapirism. So this is kind of redefining the work that we did, which is fine. I mean, we all have that right. 2 more. As I said, there's been a fair bit of incorrect application of the terminology, and I don't mean to pick on these people. We've seen this in other papers, but especially in talks, and I've seen it plenty in industry. What this paper did, this is actually from looking offshore Iran, is it combined wedge halokinetic sequences and tabular composite halokinetic sequences, which we define as being different scales and sort of a different order of this whole concept. Well, they combined the 2 different things, but not only that, they applied it to mini basin scale features. You can see the scale bar here. So this is going right across entire mini basins, which is absolutely not how we define them. Moreover, they even applied them to things that aren't diapirs. This is just a salt pillow. And we defined our halokinetic sequences as being part of passive diapirism. So again, they're not alone in doing this, but I'm going to get into this later. We would urge people to use different terms for large-scale features. Specifically, we call them tectonostratigraphic packages or successions, and we'll get into that in the second part of the talk. And then finally, one more just came out this year. And what was done here is this also, what they did is they combined both the mini-basin-scale, which you can see, for example, in this upper blue unit, and the local scale, and you can see the upturn right next to the diapir. They combined them into sort of one categorization, and they termed them, remember, ours are halokinetic sequences, and they termed these halokinematic sequences, which I personally find very confusing. Not only that, but in their halokinematic sequences, they include on-lap wedges and truncated hooks. So they use that same terminology, but it's not the same. So again, I find that really confusing. And I don't know, maybe I'm biased and with our own stuff, but I beg you not to use this. I think it really adds to the confusion. And again, with all due respect to the co-authors, one of whom is a friend of mine. So anyway, have to say it. So let's look at some possibilities. I've got 8 scenarios here, all with the same diapir that is either at or just beneath the surface. So you can see there's some with no roof, there's some with a thin roof, some with a thicker roof, some with a partial roof, where you're getting on-lapping the edge, but the very crest is exposed. Or it was covered, and then erosion removes part of the roof, but part of it is still covered. Or there's a thin roof, but in some areas it's slumped and the salt is exposed. So, and it may be folded roof or maybe fault-bounded roof. So first, a couple of comments on this. One, this depends to some degree on the depositional environment. If you're in a non-marine depositional environment, depending if you have a high enough rate of salt rise, so salt coming up to the surface, relative to sediment accumulation rate, because you have no hemipelagic rain of mud, you will generally have exposure. Now, if you have rapid enough deposition, you'll get a roof on there. And of course, it can fluctuate. In a marine environment, we always have a hemipelagic rain of mud, so it's more typical to have a roof of some thickness on there. So again, depositional environment plays a big role. I want to emphasize, of course, it can vary spatially around a diapir, and you can see that just here, for example. But you can have it covered in one area and not covered in another. And of course, it can vary over time. It will switch back and forth between some of these scenarios, depending on all these different variables. It may or may not have halokinetic sequences of different types. Usually they do. And this is where the terminology comes in, where if you have a thin roof, you get these hook halokinetic sequences, and they stack to form tabular composite halokinetic sequences. Sorry about the terminology, but you do get used to it. Just keep repeating it as you go to sleep every night. If you have a thicker roof, you actually get a broader zone of folding, and so we get our wedge halokinetic sequences, and they stack to form these tapered composite halokinetic sequences. But I want to emphasize each of these, every one of these I'm showing here, is showing near surface syn-depositional growth, sometimes exposed, sometimes not. And each, therefore, each represents a single stage in long-lived near surface diapirism. Therefore, we would strongly suggest that all of these are examples of passive diapirism, whether there's no roof or whether there is a thin roof. And that's one of the key messages of this talk. Let's look just a brief diversion to salt sheets in this very influential paper by Mike and Martin back in '06 on a lock-in salt. I'm going to ignore the one on the bottom right, which is an unusual scenario. I want to focus on the other 3. But first of all, let's back up, because there's often confusion about this. A salt sheet is a salt diapir, because a salt diapir, by definition, has a truncating relationship with younger stratigraphy, and that's what a salt sheet has. So because these may grow at the surface, or beneath a thin roof, as you can see here, or some combination where it's partly covered and partly exposed. These are also, by analogy to what I've just said here, these are also all forms of passive diapirism. So should we give up entirely on active diapirism? No, not at all. Absolutely not. So what we would argue, and by the way, Bruno Vandeville is one of the reviewers of this manuscript, and he stated in there that he agrees completely. And so I don't know about the rest of you, but when famous Bruno agrees with me, then I know we're doing something right. Just kidding. Bruno, I hope you're listening. Anyway, we would argue, as they did back in their 92 paper, that it applies to that single brief stage when some precursor salt structure has enough pressure to break through its roof. And once it does that, it then continues to rise passively as long as there's an adequate supply of salt. So that initial precursor diapir may be, as in their paper, an extensional reactive diapir. It may be a contractional salt cord anticline. It may be a salt pillow being driven by differential loading. But again, if there's enough pressure in this and the roof is thin enough, the salt will arch that roof, break it, and reach the surface or near surface as more sediment is being deposited and continue rising as a passive diapir. There's another scenario, which is also from Bruno's work with Cora Nilsson in this case in 95, where if you have a buried inactive diapir and you then have shortening applied to it, then you squeeze that diapir, you fold the roof, and this is the so-called diapir rejuvenation, and that's also a form of active diapirism. So just to wrap this part up, we took the definitions from Mike and Martin. And Mike, I apologize for taking such liberties, but it's what we did. We've modified them a little bit. And we've adopted, of course, a lot of the stuff. But passive diapirism is ongoing, near-surface, syn-depositional growth of a diapir. It's typically a long-lived process after salt in a precursor structure breaks through its thin roof, although there are cases where it starts right from the beginning when there's never a roof. The diapir top may be emergent, absolutely, or partially or completely covered by a thin roof. And we say up to about 300 meters, that's in the absence of shortening, but take that number for what it's worth. I won't say with a grain of salt. Anyway, that roof may be concordant or onlapping, and the roof will be separated from age equivalent mini basin strata by some combination of drape folds or faults. And then active diapirism, we have two specific scenarios, as did Mike and Martin. Well, we called one of them, this is different, transitional active diapirism, where it's the single short-lived stage that I just showed you when the salt in a precursor structure is pressured enough to arch, rotate aside, and break through its covering strata. And then the subsequent rise again is by passive diapirism. And then this is directly from Mike and Martin. Compressional active diapirism occurs when an inactive diapir, as I just showed you, is buried, and then it gets squeezed during shortening, and this is our diapir rejuvenation. And by the way, you can possibly break through. I didn't show that, but if there's enough squeezing and you develop a thrust, for example, the salt can break through and start rising as a passive diapir again, whether it's a salt sheet or whatever. Okay, so with that in mind, I'd like now to switch the focus from those diapirs themselves with their roof to the strata next to the diapirs in the mini basins. And we published this figure in our mega flat paper. Oh my God, I forgot to cite myself. Oh, horrible. Anyway, the point is, here are composite halokinetic sequences. They have a maximum width of about 1 kilometer. Ian Alsop showed up to about 1.2 or 1.3 kilometers at Mount Saddam, but that's normally not what we see. Relief on individual one of about 1.5 kilometers or significantly less. They are these unconformity bound packages that are perched up in the mini basins. And that's in contrast to these larger mini basin scale tectonostratigraphic packages, where you also see thinning and upturn, for example, here towards the diapir, but they happen over multiple kilometers in width and of course affect the entire mini basins, or well, as you'll see, it's more complicated. There may or may not be unconformities. And then finally, megaflaps are just one end member of these large-scale tectonostratigraphic packages, where the oldest strata are turned far up the, that's more than 2 kilometers or so, and it's up to more than 7 kilometers, up the sides of steep to flaring diapirs. Exactly what cutoff angle do you use? Well, different people use different things. Just for the people in the industry who are out there, I just want to emphasize, these are your traps. Okay, this is what gives you the three-way truncations up against diapirs, whether you're in the northern GOM and it's something like Tahiti or plenty of others like that around the world. The composite halokinetic sequences are actually just complications. They're actually in here in that last little bit. So there's the broader scale structure, which gives you the larger volumes and that you see and you drill into. And often these things you might not see, especially if the salt is flaring. So they really kind of complicate things and modify the traps. And then megaflaps, they tend to lead to trap failure, mostly because the wells that drilled these usually didn't see them. So there were big surprises. Having said that, there are cases in both Angola and the Gulf of Mexico where people then drilled into the onlapping strata out in here and are producing hydrocarbons. So they can work. I want to continue with this idea of the different scales, and I find this next figure really, really useful. And it's a seismic profile at 1:1 scale, so depth, 3D depth data from the northern Gulf of Mexico that Carrie Inman and I published almost 10 years ago, showing 2 diapirs and a mini basin. And I want you to focus on the seafloor. You can see in the mini basin, you can see that the seafloor is tilted to the right. And so if you were now to drop sea level again, and deposit and just get a nice big low stand dump of turbidite coming out. Let's pretend it's just going to fill this in horizontally. You'll get a wedge-shaped fill, a recent stratigraphic fill deposit here. And you can see them stacked on top of each other all the way down through this mini basin. And these are our mini basin tectonostratigraphic packages. By the way, Kate's trying to get me to switch it to successions because that is stratigraphically more correct than packages. But this is what was in our little paper. So at the moment, I'm going to stick with it. But anyway, this is forming simply by more salt evacuation on the right side of this mini basin relative to the left side. Whether that's going up or just not subsiding much doesn't matter. And so we get this large scale features. And by the way, in case it's not obvious, what I'm getting at now has really big implications for your reservoir, for sediment transport, for your fairways, for facies variations, etc. I'm not going to get into that, mostly because I'm not qualified, but it's there. But then, so that's one scale of mini basin topography. But there's another one, which is formed by these scarps over the edges of these rising diapirs. That's what gives us our local halokinetic sequences. And so you can, on good data, you can often see how strata come in and they're tilted in one direction or another and overall wedging. And then suddenly within the last kilometer or less, you see a change in the amount of tilt, the amount of thinning, et cetera. And that's what we're seeing at the seafloor today. Just keep doing that over time. So over 20 years ago, I published a paper with Paul Weimer looking at these packages. And this is the old 2D time-migrated seismic data we had at the time. All the young geologists out there should be very happy with the data you have, because we had stuff that, it was challenging. Let's just put it that way. Anyway, I don't want to go into the details on this, but we defined 4 geometries. And it's there are layers, which are constant thickness. There are wedges, which is self-explanatory. And then this shows the need for a 3-dimensional look. You have bowls in which there's thickening from all directions into a central area, or troughs where it really thickens from 2 directions into a central trough. And of course, you can only see that in 3D because these will look the same in a 2D cut. The only time this has really been reused or sort of modified is a recent paper by Chris Jackson and co-workers looking at the precast basin. And they did the same thing, looking at layers and wedges and bowls. And they emphasized the three-dimensional, the need for a three-dimensional look. Again, totally agreed. And the point is that this is, of course, the record, as Truesine pointed out back in 1960, or really the late 50s. This is the record of the history of these diapirs. And of course, this is where reservoirs are and so on. So rather critical. So I'm going to show you some material that we presented to our consortium in 2016, but that we have not yet published. But so the rest of you are seeing it now for the first time, but it's just building on these ideas. And we do have these mini basin tectonostratigraphic packages. I'm showing them only in 2D right now. In the past, I did it with respect to landward and baseward. That's what the WL is, landward, and WB, it's a wedge that thickens basinward and so forth. But right now I'm switching it to talking about with respect to a diapir. So layers, again, constant thickness. Wedges we define with respect to that diapir. So this is a thinning wedge, thinning towards the salt, and a thickening wedge. Of course, if you have another diapir right here, then what is a thickening wedge to this diapir is a thinning wedge to that one. So you need to be careful. Are you talking about the mini basins? Or are you talking about specific diapir, etc.? I'm showing straight bedding, but of course it's usually folded. And very important, and by the way, these things span multiple depositional sequences, as I'll show you. They're large scale packages that can have lots of internal smaller wedges or layers. And there are numerous stacking patterns that are possible. Some are more common. It really depends on the style and timing of deformation. And what's important about this, again, for industry, is the stacking patterns strongly influence a number of factors here that are critical. And I'll show that to you here. So you can have just a thinning wedge. By the way, a lot of these can have a layer at the top. They can also have a pre-kinematic layer at the base. I just want to focus on this, and you can see an example from this paper. This is from Brazil, if I remember correctly. But you can see a thinning wedge where the strata are all thinning up towards the diapir. And the megaflaps, by the way, are often one end member of the style, where the basal section will come far up the side of the diapir. These generally have good trap and charge scenarios because you're charging towards the trap. The trap is nice and robust. Reservoir intervals, there is a strat component because there is thinning up towards the salt. In contrast, you can have a thickening wedge like this, and with the dips gradually decreasing upward, and because these are growth strata, of course. It's great in terms of reservoir. The maximum reservoir thickness is right in here, but there's a little minor detail like no trap and no good charge scenario because hydrocarbons are going that way. Now, there can be local turnup. That would be our halokinetic sequences right up against the salt because there was a roof that was draped over the edge of that growing diapir. In other cases, you don't have that because the roof was bounded by a fault. But I'm really talking here again, not about those local complications, but about the mini basin scale. You can stack these things. So in this case, I have a thickening wedge on top of a thinning wedge. And again, they may have a layer at the top and maybe a pre-kinematic basal layer. It's rare for them to have a layer in between these two. It usually goes from one to the other. Or if there is, it's a really thin unit. These are typical, of course, of turtle structures and some expulsion rollover structures. The lower thinning wedge may include a mega flat, but in my opinion, that's relatively rare. You can get traps, but they're usually fairly small with local charge because it's more local turn up. A lot of your hydrocarbons are going into that mini basin anticline right there. We can reverse this. We can have a thinning wedge over a thickening wedge, as you see here. And this, of course, is an excellent trap and charge scenario. And it's really good, especially for your deeper strat levels. If your reservoirs in here, it's also thickest, and therefore presumably best sand development, if you're looking at sands, right up in the top of the trap. Whereas here, again, there's going to be a stratigraphic component to the trap. And of course, you could add further complications. So here's an example where you might have, say, a turtle structure. So I've got this thinning wedge at the base, transitioning to a thickening wedge, and then I get this layer. Maybe the salt's still rising because salt's coming from the other mini basin, so this is just constant thickness. But then, let's say I have some shortening. Well, because in 3D there will be a fold or a thrust extending away, the mini basin strata get rotated. For example, the hanging wall of the thrust. And so we now rotate that and we add a new thinning wedge up on top. And what's really important about this is it's changed the trap configuration charge scenario. Here, there's no trap. And all charge is up into this. But once you do that, there's trap through most of these levels, not quite here, and a good charge scenario. So then it depends on the timing of migration. If migration was early, this is not so good. You'd have to invoke trapping of hydrocarbons and then remigration in the second deformation event. But if charge is late, then this is a great scenario. Just coming back to megaflaps, and we're almost done here. These are just 6 examples of megaflaps, 5 real and 1 a model from Oriol Ferrer, who's in the audience, I noticed. Understand that, first of all, megaflaps can also be characterized as either layers or wedges. Are they constant thickness or are they thin up as you go up the megaflap? And they may originate as prekinematic strata, in which by definition they're layers because they're constant thickness. Or they may initiate as early carapace above a precursor salt pillow or fold or something like that. And it can be constant thickness, so you get more of a layer, or it can be a wedge like here, Witchelina diapir in South Australia, where you see this nice megaflap with this wedge early carapace. And by the way, they're also divided here. Megaflaps, just as a reminder, can form during shortening. Most of them do, but by no means all of them. But they can also be without shortening, what we call halokinetic megaflaps. All right, last couple of comments. 2 slides and then we'll wrap it up. First of all, internal geometries. This whole thing is a wedge, one of these thinning wedges. But of course, there are internal complications, and you can have multiple smaller scale wedges. And we can use the terminology of Mitchum back in '77, where the internal wedges can be concordant, base discordant, or top discordant. And of course, you can also call this onlapping and this truncated. Just an example here, at the bottom, we have a layer. Then we have a thinning wedge, and then we have a transition to a thickening wedge. But if you look at that thinning wedge, the lower part looks like it's concordant, and the upper part right in there is definitely concordant. But this part in here, you can see it's one of these base discordant or onlapping wedges. And of course, what's controlling this is that fluctuating interplay between the creation of accommodation, so mini basin down and diapir up, relative to sediment accumulation rate. So just to sort of wrap up this stuff on syn-diapiric strata, I want to emphasize, so here we have a passive diapir, here we have a mini basin. I want to emphasize that there's a depositional continuum, and this is really Kate's point here. She always hammers home. There's a depositional continuum from the roof, which is also called carapace, to the depicenter. And of course, that gets folded as this rises and that sinks. Maybe the salt's coming from elsewhere because I show this welded. But that gives you this drape fold, also called a flap. So there's this surface topography, and you get infilling and draping of sediment. But again, that relief is at 2 different scales. There's the mini basin scale, which in this case we show nothing. It could be tilted to the right. And then there's that local relief right over the diapir. And that gets recorded in the subsurface as either our mini basin tectonostratigraphic packages, which again, these bowls, troughs, wedges, layers with internal complications, etc., or that local feature of a composite halokinetic sequence. And again, we have our wedge halokinetic sequences that stack into tapered composite bodies and hooks that stack into tabular, etc. By the way, these are also called perch flaps in the textbook by Martin and Mike. And then I should mention that megaflaps can be called shale sheath when there's muddy carapace along a secondary diapir. So hopefully this has helped people. Well, maybe it doesn't help you, but maybe it helps you just understand where we come from. But I want to make some suggestions. We personally, and this is kind of ironic, but we personally think that downbuilding and upbuilding shouldn't be used except in historical context. They're problematic terms. Now, having said that, Frank Peel, who's listening, and Mike Hudek, who's listening, both big names in salt tectonics, have just published a paper where they talk about downbuilding diapirs. So obviously we don't all agree on terminology. But in our opinion, a very strong opinion, the absence or presence, and if present, the thickness of the diapir roof should not be used as a criteria to distinguish between these. It's in fact what Mike and Martin called passive diapirism sensu lato is how we would emphasize using it. Doesn't matter whether it's right at the surface or just beneath the thin roof or fluctuating between, it's passive diapirism. Nor should the presence or absence of faults be used as criteria, because usually there's a combination of folding and faulting as those diapirs rise. But folding dominates. The faults tend to be small scale features. And again, passive diapirs is that ongoing, near surface, long-lived, syn-depositional rise of a diapir, again, with this roof that gets shoulder to side or no roof. And active diapirs should be used for that single brief breakthrough stage, as we talked about, or for rejuvenation of buried diapirs. And that halokinetic sequences, regardless of type, there's not that one type is part of active diapirs and one's part of passive. They're both part of passive diapirs, and it just varies based on the thickness of the roof. And it's near diapir drape folding, and that these should be kept distinct from the mini-basin-scale tectonostratigraphic packages. And these form, of course, by differential evacuation inflation, which in turn is dependent on largely on the style and timing of salt deformation. Are you getting just differential loading? Is there shortening? Is there extension? Is there some combination? Are they switching over time? That's what's controlling this. And of course, very much the three-dimensional plumbing of salt flow from the deep layer into multiple diapirs. And with that, thank you.
Well done. Thank you, Mark. That was a fantastic talk. Always great to go over some of the basics, fundamentals, and the history. And yes, I'm accustomed to having looked at that 3D time data that's in the Gulf of Mexico that you worked on in the past, and it is challenging to say the least. But there are some really great free examples out there for anybody who want to get involved with the Gulf of Mexico. So if you're ready, Mark, I think this is probably a really great time to start the Q&A portion.
Absolutely.
Okay, so
I'm not running anywhere.
So I'll start first with Trevor. Lost his name here, but Trevor said he came for 50% geology and 50% politics, and I think you've disappointed on that front.
We can launch into that, but I suspect most people will sign off right away.
There we go. All right, now asks if you mentioned that this is available online, your slides. So she'd love to know if you could tell her where to find them.
So, okay, so the part of the paper looking at passive versus active diapirism. So without the tectonostratigraphic packages, it mentions them, but doesn't show any of those figures. Anyway, that figure or that paper is a short paper online APG, and they call it online first, I think, on the APG bulletin. But it only has 3 figures. So it's got one figure with some of the historical figures, and then the one that I showed you with the different roof scenarios, and the one with the active diapirism scenarios. So other than that, it's these slides right here that are going to be available because this has been recorded.
And for those of you who haven't seen it yet, I put our AAPG members site link in there, a link to sign up for the email list, and then also the link to the YouTube channel for the replay, so you can see Mark's replay once it's available on YouTube.
And I should mention, by the way, as I just look at your comment, that in terms of the definitions, we also have some slightly refined definitions of mini basin and roof and so forth, and that's in that short APG paper. It's a geological note is what they call these papers.
And speaking of definitions, Mike Hudek and also an anonymous attendee have sort of asked similar questions, where Mike says, as you state, one of the problems in terminology is that passive diapirism contains phases of active rise. Quite true, he says. However, I'm not sure that your new definitions resolve this problem. You refer to the initial breakthrough as transitional active diapirism and all subsequent breakthroughs as part of passive diapirism. However, Mike would argue that mechanically and geometrically, all breakthroughs are the result of the same set of processes. We just call one of them transitional active and the other passive. Am I missing something?
No, I mean, and this is the problem because, you know, this is so often the case in salt tectonics. I mean, look at the definition of a lock-thin salt. It is subhorizontal to moderately dipping salt. Oh, so where's the cutoff? Is it if the dip of the salt is dipping 30 degrees, is that a lock-thinness? What about 40 degrees, et cetera? So we know we have a whole range. This is slightly different. Same thing with megaflaps. Mike, what I would suggest is that one of the key differences is looking at the sedimentary response, the strata, not focusing so much on the salt, but on the strata. Because when you have that precursor structure, it might be a reactive diapir where you're getting thickening down towards the edge of salt because of the normal faults, or you might be getting sort of larger scale thinning because of a salt cord anticline or a pillow folding, so forming over the scale of several kilometers. And yes, then that first stage is where you are breaking that roof, and that starts the very local thinning that is part of the halokinetic sequences. So you're absolutely right. The process is the same. You're arching that roof, and it's really breaking it out more as a matter, as a guide to helping us understand the processes of going from a precursor structure with the larger scale features and different relationships of salt to sediment to, yes, now we're getting that very local folding, and that starts our whole passive process. So we actually talked about, should we just get rid of that active stage and just say it goes from, say, reactive to passive? But we decided it helps just understand the processes, and we also like continuity as much as possible with things that have been done in the past, and that's how it was defined in the paper by Vonderville and Jackson. We decided to stick with that. But yeah, I mean, absolutely.
And so along those lines, the anonymous attendee wants to know if you would say then that most diapirs have a history in which they are active and later inactive, and mini basins show the sequence of both growth history.
Okay, so first of all, that just brought up a related issue. We have to be really careful about this term active or passive, et cetera, because these are, or even reactive, these are terms in the common English language. We use them all the time. Any diapir that's growing is actively growing. And we always talk about salt being passive. We talk about salt reacting to what's going on around it. So you have to be careful. So I wouldn't say an inactive diapir and relate that to active. I mean, there you're just describing whether it's alive or not in a sense. So we have to be very careful. We're talking about specific styles and stages. But yes, generally, and there are exceptions to this, but generally, there will be some trigger: extension, shortening, or differential loading. Those are the big three. And it usually is early, or it's later and there's a bunch of erosion to thin the roof enough, but whatever, usually it's early. And so the top of the diapir has only a thin roof relative to mini basins. You build up more and more pressure. At some point, you get that breakthrough, that initial breakthrough. And then it rises as a passive diapir as long as there's still deep salt to flow into it, and or if you have shortening. You can run out of deep salt, and Mike and others have shown this, and you have shortening, you can keep driving passive diapirism. And then they run out. Once they run out of salt, they get buried. And that's when it's no longer actively growing, it just gets buried. And so that tends to be how I look at it. But I want to emphasize, there is no one, and we all know this, clean-cut scenario that all diapirs follow. It's just so that's where having an understanding, and where if we use the common terminology, we can help communicate our individual diapir and mini basins, et cetera. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question very well, but.
Well, Anonymous, you can let us know if Mark answered your question.
And you can always contact me.
Yeah. So additionally, Leo says, Mark, thanks for the excellent review talk. Do you think we can apply composite halokinetic sequences or HSS concepts to all shapes, e.g. inclined, narrowing, flaring diapir, etc., of passive or active diapirs, and to different depositional settings, such as fluvio-continental, shallow waters and deep waters? What different relationships should we expect?
Okay, we can go on for hours about this, but I'll try to keep it short. All good questions. I'm going to take them in sort of reverse order. So first of all, depositional settings. We have seen halokinetic sequences and composite halokinetic sequences. I'm just going to say halokinetic sequences to keep it easy. In non-marine, fluvial, alluvial settings, we've seen them in shallow marine carbonate and shallow marine siliciclastic settings, and we've seen them in deep marine settings, whether it's turbidites or marls, etc. So because, as Mike pointed out, the actual process is the same. The mini basin is going down, the diapir is going up. If there's a roof, it will get folded and broken and rotate to being on the side of the diapir. There are exceptions. That's if the roof is just folded. If you have the roof of a diapir that is bounded by a fault, then the diapir can keep rising without any folding of the mini basin strata. So there are variations on that. Okay, so first of all, so the depositional setting where it comes into play is actually how the sediment responds to this creation of topography, this relative accommodation. And so turbidites will do it a little bit differently than fluvial systems. Certainly a big difference with carbonate platforms, because whereas the siliciclastics thin up onto the salt, the carbonate platforms, and this was shown by Poprovsky looking at the Bacchio diapir, but also we have a paper that's just been accepted on Bacchio diapir that gets into the differences between carbonate platform settings and turbidite settings on halokinetic sequences and passive diapirism. So there are some exceptions, but still the overall process is the same. And then the final thing, the shape of the diapirs, and you started to address that, Leo, with your own paper in the Precambrian, as you know, which is why you're asking the question. And one of the things about, there's a paper that it's online available right now in Journal of Structural Geology. It talks about near diapir deformation. So if anybody wants to have an exhaustive look at near diapir deformation from my perspective and all my co-authors, from Kate and others and the Barcelona group and Mark Fisher and so on, that's in the Journal of Structural Geology. But the point we make is that there are two main things that control the width of the folded zone around the diapir. One I've already mentioned, which is the thickness of the roof. But the other one is what you're talking about, Leo, which is it's sort of where on the scarp the salt breaks through. If you imagine a vertical diapir with a scarp and the diapir keeps rising vertically, you'll preserve the fold next to the scarp, next to the diapir. But if you have a low angle salt sheet, so something flaring, the salt tends to break out at the toe of the scarp, so the folded strata don't get preserved beneath the salt and you don't see halokinetic folding. And conversely, if you have a diapir narrowing upward, you'll have a broader zone of thinning because of that geometry. And then it's going to depend again on where the salt breaks out. So for example, in the Paradox Basin, we have some diapirs where we had this long-lived burial of the diapir forming these wedges. And if the salt were to continue rising in the center, we'd end up with kind of this weird scenario in between where you're starting to get halokinetic sequences, but then the salt breaks out, but it's a broader zone of folding and so forth. So there are complications. What's important is understanding the interplay between these different processes. So that's a long-winded answer because there are different parts to that question, but hopefully that helps.
So Mark, I think you maybe answered Frank Peel, who was possessing Jill App's question about the different processes in different settings where erosion is much stronger. So Frank, if I didn't catch that one, if he didn't answer it, please ask again. Mark, the paper you referenced on near diapir deformation, is it titled Folding and Fracturing of Rocks Adjacent to Salt Diapirs?
It is.
So I'll put that in here for everybody.
Oh, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yep. A little bit of a change of pace here. Antonio Ravaglia wants to know, do you have better reservoir quality in the thickening side of wedges?
Okay, so not necessarily at all, because I'll give you an example. Let's look in map view and you have a series of mini basins and diapirs. And let's say that your turbine, we're in a turbidite setting, and turbidites are coming from the north, and there's a restriction between two diapirs in map view. Okay, and then the turbidites will come through that and enter your mini basin as they flow south. If that mini basin is tilted towards the south, you will have thickened the thickest strata down at the southern or distal end of the mini basin, and it'll be thinner up on the and then the thinner part of your mini basin will be at the north at the mini basin entry point. But mini basin entry points can give you fantastic reservoir quality, because as your turbidites come through, basically the flows diverge, slow down, and drop out more sand. So you can have better net to gross and better reservoir quality in terms of porosity and permeability up where it's thinner on the high than down in the thick. So there are other factors that are entered into reservoir quality. It sometimes is as simple as what's high and what's low, but many times it's not. And people like Jill Apps and others can answer that way better than I can.
And Chris Clinkscales asks, why are megaflaps more often associated with shortening?
That's a fair question. And hello, Chris. I haven't seen you in ages. Anyway, just for everyone out there, he's part of the Sewanee Mafia, which never mind. It means something to some of the people who are listening. But so first of all, we hope to address that question in a study that we propose looking at data from the Northern Gulf of Mexico to go around and categorize in this one large area of the Gulf with the best data possible, all the megaflaps we can find. Which ones are related to shortening, which ones are not. On the basinward side, the landward side, lateral flanks, one side, both sides, height, dip, you can go on and on. I had a whole spreadsheet made up. So first of all, we haven't done the work to really answer that question, okay? But the second thing is that, of course, what you're trying to get is some strata that are rotated up to near vertical over quite some distance. And of course, in shortening, right away, if you have a thrust and you're getting a diapir breaking out of that, you've already got one side, one mini basin thrust up to a high level. So just in a very loose way, you can almost kind of imagine it's just easier to kind of keep going and get to near vertical dips. In terms of the non-contractional ones, or just another case, just imagine a salt core anticline, and we get this nice vertical isoclinal salt core anticline, okay? Upright isoclinal with vertical limbs. Now breaks all out the middle, you've got megaflaps on both sides. With the halokinetic ones, it very much depends on where the roof is and where the roof breaks. So I think our normal scenario is we kind of have a rounded top, and our roof breaks in the center. So if the diapir is, say, 3 kilometers wide, you have no more than, say, 1.5 kilometers on each side that ends up draping on the diapir. But if you have a diapir that's, say, 5 kilometers wide and the roof breaks on one side, then that whole 5 kilometer panel can rotate and you get a large megaflap. So, and that's in a paper by Freddie Escosa on Gypsum Valley, those concepts. So Chris, there's a lot of work still to be done to understand these things. I'll just put it that way.
And since you're already speaking about pillows, Heyman Koyi wants to know, what do you call a diapir which evolves from a pillow in the core of an anticline, whose crest then erodes and initiates differential loading?
Hello, Heyman. How are you? I hope you're doing well. So, that's, yeah, so you just, I would call it what you just called it. I mean, it's something that started with shortening. You get a salt core anticline. You then say you wrote the crest, shortening stops, so you now have enough differential pressure, and the mini basins keep going down, and the salt high keeps going up. And so now it's a salt pillow. Well, it was to begin with, but first it was shortened, and now it's not. And then it may or may not break through in an active stage to form a passive diapir. I mean, it's because, again, they don't all fit into simple categories. And I guess one of the key things is, as I emphasize in my courses, is these diapirs are the weak points in your basin. They're the weakest rock. And so anything that happens in that basin tends to happen to them. Not always, but if there's any shortening, any extension, any strikes at faulting, it tends to link these diapirs. So you have these multiple stage histories. So you combine that with this plumbing system of this deep reservoir whose thickness is changing over time and is different in different places, with different pipes, if you will. Some are wider, some are narrower, some are being squeezed, some are not. One mini basin might be feeding 4 diapirs, another diapir might be getting 3 mini basins feeding it. There's this incredibly complicated plumbing system. Add on to that the sedimentation and where the sediment's going, et cetera. And every one of these things is distinct. Oh, there are some common patterns. But I think you described it very well, Hemant.
So, you know, kind of along the same lines, what would produce more significant relief on the top of a diapir? Passive growth or active rejuvenated mechanism? From David Gamboa. Also, on a marine setting, wouldn't exposed diapirs be too prone to be dissolved and remove relief?
So again, these are these are all questions we could all go on for hours on. Okay, a couple parts to that. One is what gives you more relief? Shortening. I mean, shortening is what gives you the most relief in general. Whether you're squeezing a diapir or it's the front of a salt sheet where everything is moving from up dip. You can have very thick roofs. You can have relief on the Sigsbee Escarpment. The relief there gets up to close to 1 kilometer from the basin floor out in front of the salt to on top of the front of the Sigsbee canopy. So the relief is generally greater when you have shortening rather than compared to just passive diapirism. I've already just, so I've got to go find, what was that second part of that question again? Hang on. Did I miss it?
In marine settings, wouldn't exposed diapirs be prone to dissolve and remove?
Right. So dissolution is another topic, and there's no question in marine settings that when the salt is exposed to the seafloor, that yes, it dissolves, and we see evidence for that today, and you can see it in the past. The key though is marine settings, it's rarely exposed, or only, if you look at the northern Gulf of Mexico today, and we're in a high stand, so we're in a time of relatively slow deposition, we're just draping with hemipelagic mud. The point is that if you look at it, 99 point something % of the shallow salt is covered by a roof of that hemipelagic mud, and only locally is exposed because of slumping or something like that. It can also be erosion by loop currents and whatever else. But so the point is that back in '95, the Exxon group, and Mike was one of the authors on that paper, Ray Fletcher did some modeling. I'm not really sure, I don't remember the details, and so Mike can probably answer this better than I can, where they showed that just a relative, just like 10 meters or so of condensed mud on top of salt is enough to inhibit any significant dissolution. So dissolution tends to be most common when you've got either exposed salt or you have circulating groundwater, fresh water that can dissolve the halite and carry it away. But ultimately, dissolution for the story I'm talking about isn't all that critical. It is in some ways, but they're relatively minor, because it's still sort of net supply of salt up to the near surface relative to sediment accumulation rate that is the big driver and controlling variable in all of this.
So then, is it It is common to see, from Renato Fonseca, it is common to see reference to compressive settings in salt diapir provinces in the Brazilian pre-salt play area. Isn't that incorrect terminology because there is no shortening associated to the process, but rather passive growth of salt features?
Can you read the beginning of that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. So Renato Fonseca says it's common to see references or reference to compressive settings in salt diapir provinces in the Brazilian pre-salt play area.
Okay, got it. So yeah, in my, well, I'll be a surprise to no one, in my strong opinion, and please understand, strong opinions don't always mean that you're right. After all, my dear president has strong opinions. Oops, did I say that? You knew I had to get something back in here. Anyway, in the pre-salt, okay, first of all, pre-salt, of course, you're just describing an area. So let's call it the Sao Paulo Plateau, for example, in the Santos Basin. In my opinion, there absolutely is shortening. Do you like that? In my opinion, there absolutely is. I sort of think there has to be, anyway. So we can, there's extension up dip, there's shortening down dip. You can see locally some thrust. You can see folding that is not just differential loading. I think there absolutely is contraction, shortening, gravity driven above the salt in the Sao Paulo Plateau. I won't say it's exactly everywhere, but large areas. So I don't think that's a mistake. I think that's correct.
Awesome. Awesome, thanks. So Mohammed Barbi asks, what do you think about interconnection between these diapirs, passive and active, and salt sheet structures?
Salt sheath?
Sheet. Sorry.
Sheet. Okay, sorry, I missed that. So as I said, okay, salt sheets, you can kind of look at them in two broad divisions, if you will. Some would form at depth under significant roof. And that'd be an example where you have a salt layer and a thrust emanates from the salt during shortening and carries salt up in the hanging wall of a low angle thrust. Typical full and thrust belt geometry. It's just there's salt as part of the hanging wall. By definition, that isn't a locked in a salt sheet. Okay, as pointed out by Mike and Martin in their 2006 paper. So by definition, that's a locked in a salt. And that is, I wouldn't even, I wouldn't apply the term active diapirism. It's the hanging wall of a thrust. I suppose if you wanted to, if you really, you could push that to act, we got to put limits somewhere. But then, of course, many salt sheets are the ones that we, most of the papers have been on in terms of dealing with salt sheets in places like the Northern Gulf of Mexico. They are forming at or just beneath the surface. And so they are a form of passive diapirism. And generally, they evolve from a diapir that was already passive. So you've got a diapir growing more vertically up near the seafloor and just beneath or at or whatever. And then for whatever reason, separate issue, it starts to move more laterally than horizontally. It's still growing and moving at or just beneath the ground surface or seafloor. So it's still passive, but it's going more laterally than vertically. So those are passive. So now, one more comment on that. You can now bury that salt sheet with significant roof, and then you can have gravitational failure on top of it as everything is, and you can have, you know, a kilometer or more of section above salt lifted above regional by gravitational failure and shortening down at the toe, and that would be a form of active diapirism. So again, I can't emphasize enough. The point here is not the terminology. You know, the point is not we have to call it this and we have to call it that kind of thing. The point is, if we can at least use common terminology and understand what those terms refer to, we can communicate better about all these different scenarios, whether it's someone else giving the talk or you're trying to explain to other people, et cetera. That's really the point of this. It's about communication and understanding more than the actual terms. Sorry, Tim, you keep smiling and laughing there, so I'm laughing too.
Yeah, no, it was the voice for the definition monger. That was great. So Michael Engel, or Angel, asks, how long does it take for sediment loading to cause salt mobilization? Is it immediate, or is there a time delay of thousands or tens of thousands of years? And conversely, how long does it take for welding to halt salt mobilization and cause deflation?
Okay, so the first part of the question is how long does it take? Well, I'll give you an example. And that is that first, people used to think that the overburden had to be more dense than the salt for mobilization to start. Well, we now know that's not true. It's you can have less dense overburden. You just need to have a differential load. So I'm going to ignore any shortening, any extension, just talking about differential load here. And calculations by Peter Cobble, and they're also done by Martin Schupfer and Florian Lehner. They show that for normal strength overburden, so this would be siliciclastics that are kind of normal strength, so not carbonates, which are stronger, not highly overpressured shales, which are weaker. For those who want to get into it, it's an angle of internal friction of 30 degrees. But for normal strength overburden, all you need is basically a 3-to-1 ratio, thickness ratio, to get the salt moving. So that could be 3 kilometers here on top of salt versus 1 kilometer here, assuming they have the same density. Or it could be 30 meters and 10 meters. It could be 3 meters and 1 meter. And the density drops out because in the equation, in the math. So this can be less dense material in the salt or more dense, was that lateral gradient. So the Norphlet, we can see the Norphlet sands right above the salt. We're already sinking into the salt. The problem is the Norphlet, we don't have the age span on it because there's no biostrat data in the sand dunes. And so we don't really know the timing of that, but it was effectively right away geologically. There's a second part of the question, which of course has just escaped me.
It was, the second part of the question was, how long does it take to halt salt mobilization and cause deflation?
So, well, interesting. Okay, a lot of we've just been looking at this recently because of some things in the paradox basin. So I'm going to give a plug for a paper that's going to be submitted relatively soon. I've seen examples of diapirs that look like they get buried within, they run out of salt and stop growing within well less than a million years. I mean, just boom, it's rapid. And I mean, 100,000 years, whatever, it's quick. Now be careful. You can still see what looks like the growth of a diapir by arching over the top even when it's dead because of differential compaction. So we have to be careful of that. But we've also seen diapirs that gradually get buried over a period of, sort of 1 to 10 million years or even more. And for example, at Gypsum Valley diapir, we have a record now, and this is the paper I'm talking about. This is a paper that's going to be, it's being put together by Rip Langford at UTEP, working with Kate and with me and others, that we have a part of Gypsum Valley diapir, this 100 million year history of gradual burial of the diapir. We got these wedges and a little tilting, a little erosion nonconformity, a little bit of diapir-derived detritus, and then another one, and just kind of gradually covers the thing. And of course, we're in a non-marine environment there. So there's still salt coming up, but there's also erosion going on. How much that plays a role, I'm not sure. And I don't want to say anything more because this is really Rip's, he's the main guy on this. But it can, so the short answer to your question, that was a long answer. It could be really, really rapid and geologically speaking, 100,000 years or less. And it can be 100 million years in one demonstrated example.
So now, Sophie, I'm not going to be able to say your whole name. If you do want to ask Mark a question, I will allow you to talk. So you have the capability to unmute your mic now. Sophie? I suppose not. Okay, we'll come back to you then.
I don't see her in the list of participants right now.
Somehow she's at the very top.
Oh, that's okay. There she is.
All right. Let us know when you're ready. So Jafar Hassanpour says, great talk, Mark. Is there any difference between your transitional active diapirism and halokinetic active rise diapirism of Jackson and Hudak? I think you covered this a little bit.
Yeah, well, but see, so again, when I look at Jackson and Hudak and, you know, all the wonderful things in there, I personally find that again, this is part of what leads to this whole talk and the short paper, is that I find some of the terminology a little confusing and again, overlapping, as I said. So halokinetic active diapirism, well, I mean, halokinetic just means salt movement. Everything in a salt basin is halokinetic. We all know that. So you can have a halokinetic megaflat because it's just forming without shortening, it's just halokinetic. You can have halokinetic sequences, which are very specific things. Halokinetic active diapir, to be honest, I'm not sure, I don't remember what that is. So I'm gonna flail on this one, so I should probably just shut up.
So Mark, would you like to continue answering questions or should we call it now? It's 9:21, so we're 21 minutes after.
I'm okay till past. I don't mind.
All right, and so Leo is really wants his question answered. It says, Leo, I can't find your question. Can you just ask it, unmute and ask it? Oh, I guess maybe he stepped away.
I see one.
Yes.
Oh, here we go.
Sorry, I'm here. Yeah, so it's basically the origin of, I might have missed it, you might have described it, but those thickening wedges, thickening strata towards the diapir. Did you describe the origin for those as extension or? I
didn't. So what I would suggest coming, and that's an interesting question. So from what I've seen, let's say we have one of those thickening wedges. And as I pointed out, sometimes there's only a thickening wedge and sometimes there's a basal thinning wedge and then a thickening wedge, okay? I personally think that when you have the basal thinning wedge, it was obviously thinning and onlapping on some salt, and then that collapses and and that's typical of an expulsion rollover. That is typical of no lateral movement of anything other than salt, just differential vertical substance, like some features in the Northern Gulf of Mexico, like the counter-regional systems, and we can document this. In contrast, we have only a thickening wedge, no basal thinning wedge, then I would argue is probably short extension. Now, you could have potentially a combination where you have the initial thinning wedge and then extension kicks in, so you could get a combination. So there you have to look more regionally to try to determine whether it's extension or just salt evacuation.
Cool. Yeah, that's I completely agree. That's good. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And sorry for asking too many questions or too long questions.
We expect
it.
Cheers. Someone you maybe know a little bit, Thomas Heron says, Mark, great talk. Thank you. I don't have the citation, but have you seen Jim Blackerby's presentation on classification of sequence geometry adjacent to welds around 2012-ish? Perhaps this might help with the new classification that you and Kate are working on with mini basin tectonic strat geometry, the geometric classification.
Yeah, Thomas, hello there. We were just communicating actually yesterday in email, so it hasn't been too long. I tell you, those ex-students of yours, they just never go away. You know, you hope they just disappear, but no. Thomas, just joking, as you know. Anyway, I do remember Jim giving a talk on that, but I don't remember any of the details at all. I remember more the talk that they gave on cross weld geometries, whether you have truncation below and parallel on the other side or different manifestations. I remember that one more. So no, you'll have to, if you can find something, you can send it to me. But yeah, so I want to emphasize that again, that in different deposition environments and different scenarios, these different things we've talked about, there will be different depositional responses. But that's the local. For the halokinetic sequences, that's the very local. If you have a sand-rich turbidite system coming in, and this is on the distal end of the mini basin, then blah, blah, blah. If you have a mud-rich turbidite system coming in and you're on the lateral edge of a mini basin, then you might see this kind of thing, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always something more regional you have to look at also before you can apply it to what's in a halokinetic sequence itself. And I will say that one of the things that we haven't done really, we've done it in the shallow marine and fluvial systems because that's where our outcrops usually are, is we do have work, and this is Kate and her students, looking at the facies variations. For example, in Poplar to diapir, you can see there's this deltaic sandstone, and then it basically come off the delta, and there's local shoaling, for example, right around the diapir, so the local shallower water. Where we really don't have that very much is in turbidite settings, because there are very few diapirs with turbidites exposed around them. Now, Zoe Cumberbatch has shown at Bacchio diapir, she's worked on the turbidites as we have. And the problem is the turbidites are generally a little farther away from the diapir because they're kind of 400 meters away. You don't see the real close in because that's marls and carbonate debarites. But still, there's no question you can see the sub-regional distribution of turbidites with respect to those diapirs in the field, but it's one of the very few places. So I'd urge you to look at some of her work. And then again, Eduard Rocca, we have a paper that's just been accepted. So hopefully it'll be in available in marine and petroleum geology within, say, a month or so. I'm not sure what the timing is going to be.
In fact, I think one of your co-authors has linked it above, Pablo Granado, and it has been available online since the 16th of October.
That really? Is it the same? What paper is that?
Salt tectonics and controls on halokinetic sequence development of an exposed deepwater diapir, the diapir basin.
Yeah, it's available. Yeah.
Jeez. What do I know? I'm just like the third author or something.
So, and I think this will be our final question because the other ones are mostly just comments to you. If you'd like to discuss them after I ask Manas Sau's question. So Manas asks, can one predict salt or shale diapirs by looking at the shallow structures?
Well, no. Okay, so first of all, a quick answer. Be very careful about the term shale diapirs. Excuse me. Shale diapirs are usually something different. So I don't even want to get into that. I don't think of them in the same way I think of salt diapirs at all. They tend to be stacked mud volcanoes or the cores of shale detached contractional structures, as opposed to, say, a passive diapir of shale like you get with salt. So I won't get into that. With salt, can you see from the shale? No. I mean, and I guess the answer to that is, can you see from the shallow strata? Can you say anything about the diapir? No, and this is the history of salt tectonics, because in our old data, we couldn't see anything. We could see there are these folded strata up shallow, and then the data got fuzzy. And you can make interpretations, and they're mostly very wrong. You need better data. You need some image of what's down there. And one of the problems is there's so many variables, as I've tried to say, there's so many factors that play a role in terms of how a diapir grows and how the strata respond, et cetera, and how the strata respond to the salt and the salt responds to the strata. It's all linked. That it's impossible to apply any simple model or any simple menu. If you see this, then you should have this. Once you see that, there are too many variables. You can't do it. And call me negative, but there you go. I'm just watching the world around me. Had to get one last dig in. And by the way, since I am the old white guy here, I want to apologize to everybody young that's left in this group because we screwed up your world. And I'm really sorry. I am really sorry. Please fix it, because we're obviously incapable of doing it.
Before that, I was going to say, I don't think you've gotten up to 50% geology, 50% in politics, but now I think you maybe have.
That was a bit disappointing, if I may say.
Yeah. So, it's up to you, Mark, if you want to take the time to address Yanni's and Benoit's comments here in the question and answer panel. There's no questions in them, but if you want to address those.
Okay, I'm just clicking on it here. Question answer, where is that? Why doesn't it come up? I'm not getting it to come up. Let me close the chat.
I can maybe share the screen or something.
Question and answer. That's weird. Yeah, maybe. Oh, here it is. Sorry, it's way over on my other monitor.
Yeah.
Perhaps there should be a work or a readjustment of the models for the case where diapir pieces the surface and is being subjected into dissolution, and most importantly, becoming heavier due to light component dissolution. So, you know, we do have, I mean, Kate Giles has done a lot of work along with some others in her group, for example, Ben Brunner, on the dissolution, what we see in diapirs. And we have different types of caprock. But, you know, we can see places where caprock has developed. And so you get, and it's actually a carbonate caprock, which is a whole chemical beast, which I run away from. I'll let Kate and Ben address that. But what happens is we can actually see how that caprock formed up at, well, it was at the surface periodically, because we can see reworking of caprock debris into flanking strata. So we know it formed at the top of the diapir. But where we see it today is draped on the flanks of the diapir in our halokinetic sequences. So it is folding along with what happens is, and the way, and Kate made this point in a search and discovery article in 2012, is prior to this carbonate caprock development, the real mechanical boundary is between the halite dominated diapir and the roof, whatever the roof is, the strata above the salt. Now you form a carbonate caprock at the very top of the diapir, and the mechanical boundary switches to between the halite dominated part of the diapir and that strong carbonate and anhydrite caprock. And that starts to behave with the roof. So as the salt keeps rising, that caprock also breaks and gets folded just in our drape folds and ends up flanking diapirs. Well, it's part of the diapir, but it ends up on the edges of our Basins halokinetic sequences. So it doesn't really stop the diapirism. Well, it doesn't at all. The diapirism stops when you run out of salt. There's enough pressure. And another answer to that, we know we have clasts, stringers in South Australia that can be, you know, kilometer in length and 100 meters in thickness of igneous rock. And they were part of the original layered evaporite sequence, and they got broken up during salt mobilization. They get carried up the diapirs, even though they're much more dense. They move along in a lock from the salt sheets, and they're still there today. They don't sink back down. So I don't really worry about that too much personally. Okay, and then Bernard Otto. Hello, Bernard, how are you? And Yannis, anyway. Sub-erosion may have a big impact on sedimentation as well as caprock development, which also may cause further faulting of the overburden. Agreed. Mixing active diapirism, mimicking active diapirism. So yeah, so you can, you know, if you have, okay, first of all, erosion. Well, I'm not sure what's by sub-erosion, what is being meant here. Can we unmute him just to?
Bernard, are you still there?
Hello, hello,
Yes,
Mark.
we can hear you.
Thanks for your presentation. It was very informative. Sub-erosion is basically subsurface erosion. So you mentioned, so when you have a salt body which is connected via a fault to the groundwater layer. Yeah.
Okay. So
maybe
dissolution.
you have a critically stressed fault which allows hydraulic communication, which then causes leaching in the subsurface.
Got you. Okay. So, but yeah, basically subsurface dissolution because of circulating groundwater. Yeah. So, okay. I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, so, you know, we can of course see, I mean, there are two different things going on here. I tend to, okay, in terms of caprock, which is what we're talking about, because when you're dissolving the halite, you're concentrating the non-halite minerals, whether it's anhydrites or whether, and of course, anhydrite meaning also gypsum, or whether it's some carbonates that are originally interbedded or siliciclastics. But for example, the zechstein, the carbonates and the mudstones and so forth. So I tend to divide up, well, people divide caprock up into two types. One is just this insoluble residue, which is just all the non-halite material. And then the other one is this chemical caprock, where you actually get, the general idea is that when you have migrating hydrocarbons, you have sulfate reducing bacteria. Those sulfate reducing bacteria basically munch on the anhydrite, because calcium sulfate, freeing up the calcium. The calcium reacts with the hydrocarbons, whatever source of carbonate you have, and they form the calcium carbonate, or if there's magnesium around, dolomite. And so that's a chemical caprock, a carbonate caprock, whatever you want to call it. But I actually have another distinction of two types of caprock. One is if the diapir is still rising. So there's still salt coming from depth, whatever the push is, mini basin sinking or squeezing, etc. And what happens is that you're getting downward accretion of your caprock, because as you're dissolving halite, you're replenishing it with more halite coming from depth. So if that ratio is okay, the diapir will keep rising. If you're dissolving more than you're replenishing, that's a separate story. If we take that to the extreme, then we go to the case where there's no more salt coming up because you've run out of deep salt and there's no shortening. Now, if you have circulating groundwater, like you say with a fault, you dissolve the halite, there's nothing to replenish it, so you get collapse and you get excess thickness over the top of the diapir. You can see that in the mid-Polish trough in Poland. You can see it in the Paradox Basin. You can see it in a number of places where you're getting collapse because there's no longer enough halite coming up from depth. So yes, I mean, that impacts things, but I still wouldn't call it, the diapir is dead in that second case because there's no salt coming up. Now, if you later took that collapsed roof and then you had some late shortening where you're getting active diapirism, it's inverting that little extra thick above the salt because of dissolution. So Bernhard, I'm not sure if I'm answered your question, but it's hopefully that helps a bit.
Yep, thanks a lot.
And I have another meeting in 20 minutes, so I should probably take a break.
We were just about to say the same thing. So Mark, we wanted to say thank you for such a great session and for answering questions for so long. Leo, anything you would like to add?
Big thanks, Mark. For staying so long as well and answering all those questions and for the excellent talk, of course.
And remember, since the Republicans are the only ones engaging in fraud at the ballot box by planting these boxes in California, then I think all you young Europeans should vote in our election also. We might as well, he says there's fraud on the part of the Democrats, so let's make it happen. And you guys can vote and we'll make sure he's gone. We're done.
So as a reminder, in 2 weeks on November 3rd, Berta Lopez of IMGE is speaking on mini basin salt welds and salt canopy in the external zone of the Betis Cordillera, Spain, breakthroughs from seismic reflection, outcrop, and gravimetric data. And I put in the comments where you can get more information from us on our AAPG members website, as well as how you can sign up for the Google form to get reminders and emails that eventually we'll sort out how to make sure that everybody gets our invitations. We've been having issues the last few weeks with our email notifications, and as well as the webinar replays in which you will get to see Mark again.
And by the way, I would urge everyone to tune into Berta's talk because she gives great talks, and it's a cool area.
Right. Thanks.
You owe me, Berta. Bye, guys. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Mark. Thank you, everyone.